Hello and welcome to week one of Ethics and Moral Problems here at Northampton Community College. Today we're going to talk about philosophy as method, subject, and attitude. But before we get started, before we actually delve into the actual content, I want to just say something about how philosophers think and how this is going to be beneficial, regardless of what your discipline is that you're studying or where you might wind up in life. The goals of education have changed over time. Okay, today most people think that a degree is merely a way to get a job. So that is true, right? There's two things that I hope for you. One is that you finish whatever course of study you're in and that you get a degree. And then two, that that degree is marketable to the point where you can get employment. So that's very important. But if the degree that you were getting, if the courses that you were studying were nothing more than simply a means to getting a job, then we're not really doing education. We're doing vocation. And that's not a bad thing, but there's something that needs to be said about that. Let me say this. In ancient Greece, free men were trained in philosophy, art, mathematics, natural science, etc. It was only the slaves that they trained to do just one thing. Don't think I'm equating vocational training with being a slave. I'm not. What I'm saying, and you'll see as I go through this little intro here, that if we only had one particular skill, doesn't that not limit us? In other words, it's important to have those skills, but they have to be accompanied by a wider scope of knowledge. So we want to be free persons, right? And by free, we mean I want to think free. I want to turn my thoughts into actions, and I want all that done to be based on reason. I don't want to just do it because I'm following the crowd or following the herd. So in philosophy, if someone simply took the course saying, how am I going to use this to get a job? That's not studying philosophy, all right? Philosophy is going to add to your critical thinking skills. It's going to add to your ability to communicate more clearly. And it's more aptly, let's say, directed towards living a fuller life. So in other words, increasing the ability for us to understand issues, and most importantly, to be able to identify the things in life which are really worth pursuing. In other words, a lot of times this wisdom, as us being lovers of wisdom, at the end of people's lives, they start to contemplate and say, gee, what was really important? Philosophy tries to get those things in the front of our lives and say, we already know these things are important, so we need to start pursuing those. All right? So remember, the etymology of the word philosophy means love of wisdom. So for us to do philosophy, then, we have to be lovers of wisdom. Now, I realize that that may be abstract, and you might even be thinking it's not really useful, but I want you to know this. The most sublime things in life, there are things like beauty and truth and goodness, justice, equality, fairness, love, right? Those things, people, we'll call them ideas, people have been willing to die for those things. That's how important those things are. They cannot be gathered, let's say it that way. Let me put it this way. No amount of money or no amount of success in your career can ever provide those things. And these three things in particular, beauty, truth, and goodness, they're known as transcendentals. Now, they're transcendentals because, one, they're timeless, right? So they're bound by no age, absolutely universal. They're bound by no culture, and they're bound by no country, and they are things that are shared by both gods and humans. And whether or not you've ever thought about it or not, beauty is a way by which we know things, right? So we are attracted to things beautiful. Now that could be thoughts, that could be actions, and that could be people. But I'm not talking about looks, I'm talking about people who are themselves beautiful souls. And then through encountering those people, we recognize the truth, and that truth leads to goodness. Now, goodness, we can also understand this fullness of life as happiness. As long as we understand happiness not as something as subjectively content, like what makes me happy, eating ice cream, having spaghetti, something like that. We have to talk about what fulfills us as human people. So in philosophy, this rising from beauty, truth, to goodness, it's known as the epistemological ladder. So you should have seen the word epistemology in your reading. And here's my point. This is what education used to do. It used to help us go up this ladder, okay? And I want that to be part of your experience in this course. So now, none of this, quite frankly, comes without pain. So as you watched Plato's allegory of the cave, I'm not going to reiterate it here, recognize how was that man, let's put it this way, he was pulled out of the cave. He did not walk out of there, I want to say, voluntarily. It's hard for us to move from ignorance to knowledge or from foolishness to wisdom. His whole life, this man in the cave, The only knowledge he had were the shadows on the cave wall, the reflections from what passed over the elevated walkway between him and the fire, right? And that fire was a source of light. Even if it wasn't the clear outside light, it was still a source of light and illumination. So keep that in the back of your head as to, we can still learn things. It doesn't have to be pure knowledge that we're getting. Once outside, though, he couldn't believe how things really were. Just like the discoveries that you or I might have made already in our life, or we might make in this course. We'll have these experiences. They kind of lead to new insights, but we're finding them very hard to explain and articulate. So just like us, once he knew the truth more fully, he wanted to share his newfound wisdom with his companions back in the cave. But going back in, he found out not only are they not enlightened from still being in the cave, they don't see him as anything more than the same shadows of everything else that they've seen on the wall. And to be honest, it made them so fearful that they would rather kill him than be made free with knowledge. So think about how sometimes people, rather than knowing the truth and taking the painful discovery process to get it, they're more comfortable just simply being part of the herd. That's what we want to break. So as we move into this course and we begin to study and discuss, think how that relates to the topics we're going to cover. You might find some insights and then decide to share them with those you love and know. And, having been enlightened on something doesn't make you or I better or more intelligent than anybody else. So don't think it's like that. It just means that we discovered a certain good, through beauty and truth. And that discovery can't always be communicated directly. Sometimes one must experience it for themselves. And this experience doesn't follow some rational progression, like finding the answer for a math problem, where you can, solve it systematically. So this discovery process, I think we could actually call it as the Eureka moment. Okay, so you're going to be asked, or you are being asked, to write an essay about a Eureka moment in your life. And so that I can be very clear in exactly what I'm asking, I'm going to give you my example. When I was a senior in high school, in English literature class, my teacher did not have any education degrees. He was just a very bright man who liked to read. And what an extraordinary teacher he turned out to be. For the first 2 weeks of the class, what he did with us was, it appeared to have nothing to do with English. He would have us do cryptograms. Now, if you don't know what a cryptogram is, it's sort of like, a phrase that's done in a code. So, in other words, like all the B's might, be J's and all the D's might be E's, that kind of thing. So all you see is the representative letters. You don't really know what it says, but it's a phrase with words and such. So sometimes you'll start with like the single letter, okay? If the single letter up there is F, well, a single letter is usually like the letter A or the letter I, so you try to play that around. So what was happening as a class is we would try to work through this. Sometimes it would take us most of the class to get through one cryptogram. But what happened was, there was always a few students who thought they kind of knew what it was said, at least part of it, so they would, shout it out. And other people would say, well, no, it can't be that, because then this letter would have to be that, and that doesn't match. So then before you knew it, we started correcting each other. And then all of a sudden, there'd be two or three that kind of saw it all at once, and they would say, here's what the phrase is. And then we'd all would see it immediately. And then at that point, we couldn't figure out how we didn't see it that way the first time. And we did this for 2 weeks. To be honest, I wasn't quite sure what this guy was doing or where he was going with all of this. But what he finally did was he put up, after 2 weeks, a Shakespearean sonnet. And he said, what do you think this means? Well, the same thing. The students would say, well, I think this can mean that. I said, no, it can't mean that, because then this would mean that. The word's used twice here. And then before you knew it, somebody started saying, well, I do think it means this, and somebody would correct them. And then 2 or 3 would say, I think I know what the meaning is here. And they'd explain it. Somebody else would add to it, and then we'd all say, yeah, that kind of makes a lot of sense. What he was doing was he was teaching us this discovery process. It really was a Eureka moment. So my point is, this is basically how we come to certain conclusions. This is how we get out of the cave, and sometimes these experiences are, let me say it this way, the knowledge that we gain isn't something we can simply transfer to somebody else by telling them. We almost have to find the way to bring them through the same experience that we had. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Now, to the textbook you read, philosophy can be understood in 3 ways, right? As a method, a subject matter, or as an intellectual attitude. I want to talk about those. So first of all, as a method, it can be seen as overlapping other disciplines, right? Such as economics. So even if economics studies, how to distribute money, philosophy might come in there as a method and say, but what types of distribution are just? Neuroscience might talk about the neurobiology of the brain, but the philosophers will come in and say, yeah, but how does freedom relate to this neurobiology that they're studying? And so on. So the distinction is that philosophy asks different types of questions. As an aside, there'll be a bunch of asides. You know, originally there were only two disciplines, theology and philosophy. So whatever wasn't the study of God fell under philosophy, and that was everything else. Theology was related basically to the revealed truths, and then philosophy was everything else. It's only of late, like the last 500 years or so, where philosophy has become a subject in itself, which would probably seem pretty odd to the ancient philosophers if they came in to a university today and found out that you had a philosophy department. They would probably say, well, do you have a truth department? Do you have a beauty department? That's how odd it would all sound for them. But anyway, philosophy, let's just say this, it's the application of rational thought to problems. So you can imagine that there's much that will contribute to, all the other disciplines. Now, also, philosophy is a subject matter. Now, philosophy asks some basic questions that really become, subfields of philosophy in themselves. So, for instance, when philosophy asks what exists, that's known as metaphysics. When the medical or technology field asks what is a person, this is within the competency of metaphysics. Another type of question is, what or how do we know? And, that's epistemology. Now, that might sound odd to you, because we always claim to know things all the time, like how do you know, or I know. But philosophers want to know how we know, all right? So, for instance, in science, something really isn't proven. What we say is it's unfalsifiable. That is, we accept it as known and knowledge because it really can't be proven not to be known. That didn't come from science, that came from philosophy. And that particular field is known as the field of epistemology. Now, the third type of question is what should we do? And that, of course, is ethics and the focus of this course. So economics and medicine, they're capable of discovering what we can do. That is with economics, how to increase production or profit, or in medicine, how to modify genetic traits, increase fertility, etc. But just because something can be done does not mean that it ought to be done. So what we're going to look at in this course is, how do we determine what ought to be done? So determining the ought in terms of genuine happiness, the public common good and such, those are things we're going to be talking about in this course, and they all fall underneath, obviously, the field of ethics. Now, finally, philosophy as a subject matter deals with the aspect of reflective activity, right? This is an attitude of critical and systematic thoughtfulness. So this includes very crucial concerns for human happiness and responsibility. In other words, in this way, we would say, does the human person have free will? If we don't have free will, how can we really hold you accountable for the things that you've done? Or we could ask questions like, what is the goal in life? Why am I here? How about, am I my brother or sister's keeper? I know that comes from Christian scriptures, but a lot of questions that we deal with are this, they bleed over into the same things that they also consider in theology. But when I ask, am I my brother's keeper, what I'm really asking, just from a philosophical point of view, is what's my responsibility to other people? Or two, philosophy will ask, does God exist? All right. So anyway, a little behind there on that. I'm sorry. At its most basic level, philosophy begins the moment that one person asks, why do humans ask why? Just think about that question. Why do human people ask why? It's really about inquisitiveness, right? And this is known as wonder. And that wonder is what philosophy encapsulates. There is not an area of life that philosophy cannot enrich. This is why Socrates could clearly and succinctly state, the unexamined life is not worth living. So it's good to question things, but you really need to develop the skill to ask good questions. And we have to know the proper reasoning to help us towards a deeper understanding so that we can grasp beauty, truth, and goodness. And philosophy has the power to do that, and has the power to move us from wonder to wisdom.